Bullet Heaven HD has looked at an awful lot of shooting games over a very wide variety of systems, generations, and game types. Blasting the Japanese Imperial Army in 1943 on the NES, running and gunning to stop Gold and Silver in Gunstar Heroes for Genesis, or messing up a huge bee's day in Doranpachi Saidai Aojo showed us all which games were the best and worst since the very beginning. Or did they? It's finally time after 5 full years to take a look at the shooting games that really started it all in home entertainment. The Atari 2600 made its way to North American home consumers in 1977, and later saw release in Europe in 1978 and Japan in 1983 as the Atari 2800, presumably to be crushed by the Famicom released the same year. In North America and Europe at least, the Atari 2600 paved the way for every future generation to come, even though it led to a pretty serious crash very early in video games' home infancy. It may be crude and oversimplistic, but one fact remains undeniable: the Atari 2600 still has some real shooting gems in its otherwise hopelessly outdated catalog. Shooting games from the late 70s and early 80s have come to be known recently as Protoshmups, shooting games that retain the earliest semblance of a modern shooter but lack the structure, control, or abilities that later pure shooting games would eventually have.
This term only applies to the earliest developed shooting games, as features like rapid fire, moving in 8 directions over the whole playfield, weapon power-up, finite stage sets, and bosses have since been added to successive entries in some of these games' future series installments.
There are many more Protoshmups out there that we're sure to visit in the future, but these 10 titles should give you a feel for what the earliest home console shooting games were like on the most popular home system of their time, up until 1982. It may not look exactly as you might remember the classic 1978 arcade Space Invaders to look, but the Atari 2600 version of this classic series is, in fact, the first ever shooting game as we know it made for the home market. Despite its very primitive and foreign-feeling visuals and sound, this is definitely still Space Invaders, albeit with a nasty case of the wonk.
Like a lot of the earlier shooting games to come, Space Invaders' movement is locked only to left and right, allowing for players to hit the invaders further down the line and allowing for their shots to be avoided. These controls are pretty sluggish though, and the one shot at a time mechanic still applies here.
The series' trademark buildings are also intact, but disappear when the invaders get to a certain point. Other game types within Space Invaders have moving buildings and missing buildings altogether, making for a more challenging game type. Its early nature also means that scoring is incredibly simple, with bonus points only awarded through killing UFOs that fly across the screen.
Despite its shortcomings, Space Invaders is typically a must-have in any Atari 2600 library, especially at under $3 loose. These shortcomings may not make it a game you'll stick with though. Space Invaders gets a 3.25 out of 5.
"1981 saw many more home versions of classic Atari arcade shooters, including Asteroids, albeit, once again, in a very scaled-down form. But, as is the case with Space Invaders, Asteroids on Atari 2600 is still a very faithful game to its obviously superior arcade counterpart.
Asteroids is one of the earliest home examples of an arena-based shooting game, pitting players in a lone ship against the solar system's worth of asteroids and even random UFOs in an attempt to save the Earth from annihilation.
Players have free-range movement about the screen, with left and right controlling the angle your ship faces and up providing thrust for movement. Your ship will coast thanks to the lack of gravity, so care is needed that you don't end up as Space Rock Pizza.
Any direction you face you can shoot, and a fast trigger thumb can make quick work of the asteroids in each round. In a pinch, players can also warp out of harm's way by pulling down on the control stick, but care should be used as it's entirely possible to warp into an asteroid.
Simple scoring once again takes center stage with more destruction equaling more points. With a finite counter for 99,999 points, exceeding this score will reset the score to 0. Multiple score laps are entirely possible.
Asteroids ends up being a super playable game even after so many years on such rudimentary hardware. Any Atari collectors simply must have this game in their collection. Asteroids gets a 4.5 out of 5.
Like Asteroids, Atari's port of Williams' Defender also made its home debut in 1981. Defender is an early side-scrolling shooting game with an emphasis on protecting humans from alien abduction. Unlike many future side-scrollers though, the stages do not auto-scroll.
Defender has a multitude of opposition to contend with. Your typical saucer-type UFOs are the ones to destroy, as they are the ones that will abduct the city's populace, indicated by a big white square. Other enemies split into multiple foes, while others still are more aggressive and will end up chasing you down.
Pressing the controller's button will change your ship into a supercharged beam of energy, which makes short work of anything it hits. You can even save humans from their xeno-hazardous fates by catching them as they fall from their destroyed captors for bonus points. But if they're abducted, you have to contend with additional alien aggressors in the form of human-alien mutants. If all of the humans are abducted though, it's game over regardless of your livestock.
An innovative feature introduced by Defender is the radar display, which shows the locations of human, enemies, and your ship. This allows players to get a good idea of what's going on beyond the scope of the game screen. As such, like Asteroids, Defender is an incredibly playable game despite its very, very early release to the home market.
Defender is one of the earliest games I remember playing. So easy to control a 2-year-old can play it, as I did, but difficult to master like the finest games, and with some of the best cover art of the first generation of video games, Defender is another must-have Atari 2600 masterpiece. Defender gets a 4.75 out of 5.
Atari's Yara's Revenge is the story of a huge spaceflight of the Yars, looking to defeat the Kotile, the killer of one of its home planets. This game was made exclusively for the Atari 2600 in 1981.
The game screen allows for movement in 8 directions, which allows players to avoid a seeking missile attack indicated by a floating bar and the swirl, a devastating, sometimes homing Kotile attack. Traversing the top or bottom limits of the stage allows players to go to the opposite end of the screen, allowing for a bit of strategic maneuvering.
The Kotile is protected by a barrier that can be shot or nibbled away directly. If Yar is in the neutral zone though, he won't be able to shoot at the Kotile. Once a path is cleared, touching the Kotile arms a cannon attack that flies in from the left side of the screen when the button on the joystick is pressed. If the Kotile or the swirl is destroyed by this cannon, the stage is complete and the next round begins.
Care should be used when this attack is engaged, as collision with it will destroy your Yar. In addition, touching the Kotile if it just so happens to be charging up the swirl will kill you deader than a can of Raid as well. At varying scores, the barrier color will change and the Kotile's attack patterns will alter, making for a more challenging game as you make your way up in score. Extends are also able to be obtained.
Yar's Revenge isn't a very flashy game, especially with a super garbled neutral zone that looks like it's a glitched out strip of junk graphics. The sound isn't especially great either. Despite this, Yar's Revenge is still pretty fun, and it gets a 3 out of 5.
Centipede is yet another arcade classic shrunk down to fit the confines of the Atari 2600's limited capabilities, released to the system in 1982. But, once again, it still manages to work rather well.
Centipede is a Space Invader-styled fixed shooting game that has players trying to kill off a centipede making its way steadily to the bottom of the screen. Unlike a Space Invaders type scenario though, the centipede will go to a lower tier when it hits a mushroom, indicated by a small square.
Players attack one shot at a time as the centipede approaches, and it will split into several independent segments depending where it's hit. The centipede isn't the only opposition you'll find though. Spiders are much deadlier with their unpredictable movement, and scorpions and fleas will add more barriers to funnel the centipede towards you at a rapid pace.
If the centipede reaches the bottom of the screen though, there is a bit of hope. Players can move their ship a tiny ways up the screen to avoid the centipede as it works its way back up the screen. Kill the centipede and it's on to the next round. Scoring is typical of most early shooters, but when the player dies, a tally is made of all the mushrooms on the playfield, and grants the player a score bonus. Shooting the other bugs that appear also nets decent point bonuses as well.
It's actually pretty surprising how quick Centipede actually is, and it comes off as a very good port of the original despite its obvious audiovisual shortcomings. Centipede gets a 4 out of 5.
Phoenix is a fixed shooting game that's notable for featuring one of the first bosses in shooting game history. Originally released to arcades in 1980 by its developer Centauri, Phoenix would later be ported to the Atari 2600 by Atari in 1982.
In Phoenix, players pilot a spaceship to take on bird-like alien opposition. Featuring a repeating stage set of 5 stages that ends with a boss fight against an alien mothership, progressive loops get faster and more challenging like many of the shooting games of the era.
The opposition in Phoenix can get pretty tough very quickly. One innovative technique that found its way into Phoenix is a barrier that protects the player from enemy shots at the cost of movement. Care should still be used to get out of the way as soon as possible though, since enemies will often not hesitate to fire again once the barrier is gone.
Despite its nifty innovations, Phoenix doesn't feel especially playable compared to other similar games of its time, even amongst its many clones. However, it's still a fairly competent early shooter. In the end, Phoenix gets a 3.25 out of 5.
Vanguard is one of the first auto-scrolling horizontal shooting games to see release in arcades. Developed by Toei and published by SNK in Japan and Centauri in the US, Atari later obtained the rights to an Atari 2600 port in 1982.
Being shrunk down for the Atari 2600 has made Vanguard a little less than fantastic. Shots can be fired up, down, left, and right, but only while your ship is moving in the direction you want to fire. Holding the button on the joystick makes you move a bit faster, but counterintuitively stops firing your weapons.
This makes controlling your ship a pretty big pain in the butt, especially with so many things to collide with. In some cases, E-pickups can be flown into granting invincibility, indicated by a decreasing gauge on the bottom of the screen. While invincible, a cheesy little tune plays and stops when you're vulnerable again.
Vanguard also has specific stage sets which follow a kind of pre-stage map. As you follow this map, the stage will then scroll in the direction that the map leads, ending with a simple stage set boss.
Vanguard was a serious step in the right direction in 1981, but the Atari 2600 version is decidedly quite awful compared to the original arcade variant. Vanguard gets a 2 out of 5.
Activision was one of the first third-party companies to release games to the Atari 2600. Chopper Command bears a striking resemblance to Atari's Defender, albeit with a twist.
Sporting the same style radar as Defender, players can see where their opposition lies beyond the confines of the screen, just like Atari's earlier game. However, the aircraft you need to take care of will destroy the jeeps you're tasked with defending if you're not quick enough. At stage end, the remaining vehicles will give players a bonus score in addition to the regular destruction points.
The control in Chopper Command is a bit on the iffy side compared to Defender though. Especially when changing direction, it can be pretty easy to fly into an errant shot or enemy. On the whole, Chopper Command doesn't really feel quite as fun as Defender either.
However, the visuals and sound are quite a bit better than Defender. This is a trend that Activision would continue throughout its 2600 history. On the whole, Chopper Command isn't a bad game by any stretch. It's just not as fun as Atari's Defender. Chopper Command gets a 4 out of 5.
Activision's Mega Mania was released to the Atari 2600 in 1982 and would see several ports to subsequent Atari hardware. Bearing many similarities to Sega's Astro Blaster, Mega Mania is still one of the finer fixed shooters on the Atari 2600, thanks to its frantic, aggressive gameplay.
In Mega Mania, you pilot a ship that looks like something ripped right out of the Star Trek universe. Taking on a multitude of enemy ships of different shapes, movement patterns, and size, the goal is to shoot down the whole wave before your energy gauge depletes.
Like any other fixed shooter, killing enemies provides the bulk of the score, but finishing the stage as quickly as possible will give you a bonus score according to how much energy is left.
Once again, the sound and visuals to Mega Mania are pretty solid, though there is no real background like many of Activision's other titles. The jury's out on whether this game is a total ripoff of Sega's original title, but for an original Atari 2600 game, Mega Mania is pretty fun. Mega Mania gets a 3.5 out of 5.
Vertical scrolling shooters with a background are a rare thing indeed on Atari 2600, especially when the visuals are solid. Activision's River Raid, which was released on the Atari 2600 in 1982, is perhaps the very best scrolling shooter on the system.
The controls in River Raid are quite refined, and while movement is more or less restricted to left and right, pressing up on the joystick will make the stage scroll faster, and pulling back will slow the stage down. Pressing the button will fire your jet's gun.
The key to getting further in River Raid is managing your fuel gauge as you travel along the river you're raiding. Flying over fuel depots will refuel your jet. It's also possible to destroy them for points. A skilled player can refuel and shoot the depot for points and added time.
A number of obstacles will stand in your way. Helicopters, jets, ships, and barriers need to be destroyed for defensive points. As always, extends are available when a certain score is achieved. There will also be parts of the stage that split off, leaving a player to choose which path to take.
As always, Activision's sound and visuals are top-notch in River Raid, with variable pitch in your plane's engines, as well as a good sound for your shots, refueling, and explosions. Definitely one of the better presented early Atari 2600 games by a long shot. Not only that, much of River Raid is actually randomly generated, making for a ton of replayability.
River Raid is pretty much a classic that shooting fans with an Atari 2600 need without question. Fun, refined gameplay like this is very hard to find from 1982. River Raid gets a 4.75 out of 5.
Now this is just a small taste of the Protoshmups that the Atari 2600 boasted in its early age. There are many more out there for players to find, collect, and play for themselves, all the way through 1989. Some great, others plainly terrible. The good news is that, on the whole, an Atari 2600 can often be found on its own for under $20, and any one of the games we've seen today can typically be found for under $5, making the Atari 2600 one of the least expensive systems of all time to collect shooting games for, outside of ridiculous prototypes and stuff like Gamma Attack. Happy hunting!
Asteroids gets a 4.5 out of